I'm Clara, and when I was 24, my father handed my brother a check for $100,000 to find himself while I sat in a hospital bed, grieving a miscarriage, with nothing but a pat on the shoulder and a "you'll be fine." That moment carved a wound so deep it's still tender, a scar I trace every time I doubt my worth. I'm telling you this because I know what it's like to feel invisible, to scream into a void where no one listens, to be told your pain doesn't matter. This is my story, not just of what happened, but of how it felt, the weight of it, the ache, the fire it lit inside me. I'm sharing it because maybe you've felt that weight too, and I want you to know you're not alone. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind where everyone knows your business and your last name carries expectations. My family was the kind of respectable that meant stiff smiles at church and secrets buried under the dining room table. My father, a lawyer, was the pillar of our community, always quick with a handshake and a quote about hard work. My mother, elegant and quiet, kept the house pristine and her opinions to herself. Then there was my brother, Ethan, 2 years younger, with his easy grin and a charm that made people forget his mistakes. And me, Clara, the responsible one, the one who got straight A's, who never caused trouble, who was supposed to be the perfect daughter. But perfection, I learned early, came with a price. My father had a way of looking at me, like I was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. I'd catch him watching Ethan with this warmth, this pride, while his gaze on me was always appraising, like he was waiting for me to prove something. I tried. God, did I try. I won spelling bees, led the debate team, graduated high school as valedictorian. I thought if I stacked enough achievements, he'd see me the way he saw Ethan. But every trophy I brought home was met with a nod, a "that's nice, Clara," and a quick change of subject to Ethan's latest soccer game or his potential. Ethan was the golden child, not because he earned it, but because he was the son. My father would say things like, "Ethan's got a big future," or "boys need room to grow into men." Meanwhile, I was expected to have it all figured out, to be the steady one, the one who didn't need help. It wasn't just my father. My mother, too, would gently steer me toward practical paths, teaching, nursing, something stable, while Ethan was encouraged to dream big, to explore, to take risks. I didn't question it at first, it was just how things were. But the older I got, the more it stung, like a paper cut that never healed. By the time I was in college, studying biology at Ohio State, I'd started to notice the pattern. My father paid for Ethan's car, his study abroad in Spain, his gap year that turned into 2. Me. I worked part-time at a coffee shop to cover my textbooks, took out loans for tuition, and smiled through it all because I didn't want to seem ungrateful. I told myself it was fine, that I was strong, that I didn't need their help. But deep down, I was starving for something. Approval, acknowledgement, anything to show I mattered as much as Ethan. Then came the miscarriage. I was 24, newly married to Tom, a quiet guy I'd met in my senior year. We weren't planning for a baby, but when I found out I was pregnant, something in me shifted. I felt this fierce, protective love, like I was carrying a piece of hope. Tom was scared but excited, and we started dreaming about a future with this little life. But at 12 weeks, I woke up to pain and blood, and by the time we got to the hospital, it was over. The doctor's voice was kind but clinical, explaining what my body already knew. I felt hollow, like someone had scooped out my heart and left me echoing. I called my parents from the hospital, my voice shaking. My mother came, sat by my bed, and held my hand, but she didn't say much. My father showed up later, his face tight, like he was late for a meeting. He stood at the foot of my bed, arms crossed, and said, "These things happen, Clara. You're young, you'll have another." That was it. No hug, no questions about how I was feeling. Just a dismissal that made my grief feel small, insignificant. I wanted to scream, to ask why my pain didn't matter, but I just nodded because that's what I always did. A week later, I was still raw, still waking up to nightmares of an empty crib. Tom tried to be there, but he was grieving too, and we were both too young to know how to carry that kind of loss together. I went to my parents' house, hoping for comfort, or at least a distraction. That's when I overheard it. I was in the kitchen, pouring coffee, when I heard my father's voice from the living room, low and serious. "Ethan's been struggling," he said to my mother. "He needs a fresh start. I'm giving him $100,000 from the savings. He can travel, figure out what he wants to do." I froze, the mug burning my hand. $100,000 for Ethan to find himself. Ethan, who'd dropped out of college, who'd spent the last 2 years bouncing between odd jobs and late-night parties. Ethan, who'd never had to prove anything, who was handed the world while I was scraping by. I waited, holding my breath, hoping my father would say something about me, about the hospital, about the baby I'd lost, about anything. But there was nothing, just silence, and then my mother's soft, "If you think it's best." I don't remember walking into the living room, but I must have, because suddenly I was standing there, my voice trembling. "What about me?" I asked. My father looked up, startled, like he'd forgotten I was there. "What about what I've been through? I lost a baby, Dad. I'm drowning in medical bills. And you're giving Ethan $100,000 to... what? Travel?" He sighed, the kind of sigh that said I was being difficult. "Clara, this isn't about you. Ethan needs this. You're strong. You've always been fine on your own." Those words hit like a slap. Fine on my own. Like my strength was an excuse to ignore me. Like my pain didn't deserve attention because I could handle it. I looked at my mother, hoping she'd say something, but she just stared at the floor. Ethan wasn't even there. He was off somewhere, probably sleeping off a hangover. But in that moment, I hated him. Not for what he'd done, but for what he represented. The unfairness, the double standard, the love I'd been chasing my whole life and never caught. I left that day without saying goodbye. I drove back to my tiny apartment, tears blurring the road, and sat on the couch, staring at the wall. The miscarriage had broken something in me, but this betrayal from my own family, shattered what was left. I felt like I'd been screaming for years, and no one had ever heard me. I wasn't just grieving a baby anymore. I was grieving the version of myself who believed that if I worked hard enough, loved enough, I'd be enough. That night, I made a promise to myself. I wasn't going to wait for their approval anymore. I wasn't going to keep proving myself to people who didn't see me. I didn't know how, but I was going to build a life that made me feel whole, not because of them, but in spite of them. It was the first time I realized that my worth didn't depend on their validation. It was a spark, faint but fierce, and it was enough to keep me going. The days after that promise felt like wading through fog. I'd wake up each morning with this heavy ache, not just for the baby I'd lost, but for the family I'd never really had. My apartment, with its chipped paint and second-hand furniture, felt like a reflection of me, functional, but barely holding together. Tom was trying, but our marriage was fraying under the weight of our grief. He'd come home from his job at the hardware store, his hands rough from work, and we'd sit in silence, each of us lost in our own pain. I didn't blame him, not really, but I couldn't reach him either, and I was too tired to try. I kept replaying my father's words. "You're strong, you've always been fine on your own." They echoed like a curse, because being strong didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a punishment. I'd been strong when I worked 2 jobs to pay for college. I'd been strong when I smiled through family dinners, where Ethan's stories took center stage. I'd been strong in that hospital bed, swallowing my sobs so I wouldn't make anyone uncomfortable. But now I didn't want to be strong. I wanted to be seen. I stopped calling my parents. It wasn't a decision I made all at once. It just happened, like a river drying up. My mother left voicemails, her voice soft and hesitant, asking if I was okay, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. What was there to say? That I was falling apart? That I felt like a stranger in my own life? Ethan texted once, a casual, "Hey, you good?" That made my blood boil. I didn't reply. I could imagine him, backpack slung over his shoulder, jetting off to some exotic place with my father's money while I was here, scraping by, trying to piece myself back together. Work was my only anchor, but even that was slipping. I'd taken a job at a local lab, testing soil samples for a conservation group. It was steady, but it wasn't what I'd dreamed of when I was studying biology, imagining a career in research or environmental policy. The lab was quiet, the kind of place where you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights, and I spent my days pipetting samples and filling out spreadsheets. My coworkers were kind enough, but I kept my distance. I didn't have the energy to pretend I was okay. One afternoon, about a month after the fight with my father, I was at the lab staring at a sample that had blurred into a gray smear when I heard a voice behind me. "You look like you're carrying the world on your shoulders, Clara." It was Dr. Evelyn Carter, the lab's senior researcher. She was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled into a loose bun and eyes that seemed to see right through you. I'd always admired her. She'd published papers on wetland restoration, spoken at conferences, built a career that mattered. But we'd never talked much beyond work. I forced a smile, mumbling something about being tired, but she didn't let it go. She pulled up a stool, her lab coat crinkling, and said, "You've been different lately." "Not your work. Your work's impeccable, but you. What's going on?" I don't know why I told her. Maybe it was her voice, warm but firm. Or maybe I was just so desperate to be heard. I started talking, haltingly at first, about the miscarriage, my father, Ethan's $100,000, the way I felt like I was disappearing. The words poured out, raw and messy, and by the end I was crying, my hands shaking on the lab bench. Evelyn didn't interrupt. She just listened, her face steady, like she was holding space for my pain. When I finished, she leaned forward and said, "Clara, you're not invisible. Not to me, not to the world. What you're feeling, it's real and it's heavy, but it doesn't define you. You get to decide who you are, not them." Her words hit me like a lifeline, something to cling to in the storm. She told me about her own life, how she'd fought to be taken seriously as a woman in science, how her family had doubted her, how she'd learned to carve out her own path. "It's not about proving them wrong," she said. "It's about proving yourself right." That conversation changed something in me. It wasn't a magic fix. Grief doesn't vanish with a pep talk, but it was a crack in the darkness, letting in a sliver of light. Evelyn started checking in on me, not just at work, but outside it. She'd invite me for coffee, share articles about women in science, ask about my dreams. One day, she handed me a flyer for a graduate program in environmental science at a university in Michigan. "You're too bright to stay in this lab forever," she said. "You've got something to say. The world needs to hear it." The idea of grad school felt impossible. I was still paying off undergrad loans, and Tom and I were barely making rent. Plus, there was the guilt, leaving my job, moving away, asking Tom to uproot his life. But Evelyn wouldn't let me dismiss it. "You're not running away," she told me. "You're running towards something. There's a difference." She helped me apply for scholarships, proofread my essays, even wrote me a recommendation letter that made me cry when I read it. She described me as resilient, brilliant, someone with a fire that won't be dimmed. I didn't recognize myself in those words, but I wanted to. Applying was the first step, but it wasn't easy. I'd come home from the lab, exhausted, and spend hours on my laptop, rewriting essays, crunching numbers for financial aid. Tom was supportive at first, but I could feel the distance growing. He'd watch me work, his jaw tight, and say things like, "Are you sure this is worth it? We're okay here." I wanted to scream that I wasn't okay, that I needed this, but I didn't. I was too afraid of losing him, too afraid of being alone. The night I got the acceptance letter, I was sitting on the couch, eating cold pizza. The email popped up on my phone, and I opened it, expecting another rejection. But there it was. "Congratulations, Clara." A full scholarship to the University of Michigan's Environmental Science program. I screamed, actually screamed, and Tom came running in, thinking something was wrong. When I told him, he hugged me, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Michigan," he said, like it was a foreign country. "That's far." I should have been over the moon, but instead, I felt this knot in my stomach. The scholarship was a chance to rewrite my story, to become someone I was proud of, but it meant leaving everything behind. Tom, my job, the life I'd built, flawed as it was. I called Evelyn the next day, my voice shaky, and told her I wasn't sure I could go. She didn't push. She just asked, "What's holding you back?" Not money, not ability. What's really stopping you? I didn't have an answer, not one I could say out loud. But deep down, I knew it was fear. Fear of failing, fear of losing Tom, fear of being truly on my own. That night, I sat in our tiny kitchen, staring at the acceptance letter on my laptop. Tom was at work, and the apartment was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking. I thought about my father, handing Ethan that check, telling me I was fine on my own. I thought about my mother's silence, Ethan's carelessness, the way my pain had been brushed aside. And I thought about the baby I'd lost, the tiny life that had sparked something in me, even for a moment. I didn't want to be fine on my own anymore. I wanted to be extraordinary, not for them, but for me. I accepted the scholarship the next morning. When I told Tom, he nodded, his face unreadable, and said, "If that's what you want." It wasn't the fight I'd expected, but it hurt more. A quiet resignation, like he was already letting go. We didn't talk about what it meant for us, not then. But I knew in that moment that I was choosing myself, maybe for the first time in my life. It felt like betrayal and freedom all at once. Packing up my life felt like dismantling a house I'd built with my own hands. Each box a piece of a dream I was leaving behind. The apartment, with its creaky floors and mismatched dishes, had been my sanctuary, even when it felt like a cage. Tom helped me pack, but his movements were mechanical, his eyes avoiding mine. We didn't talk about the future, about us, about Michigan, about what this move meant. Instead, we folded clothes, taped boxes, and filled the silences with small talk that felt like static. I wanted to grab him, to shake him, to beg him to tell me what he was feeling. But I didn't. I was too afraid of the answer. The day I left, Tom drove me to the bus station. It was a gray morning, the kind where the sky feels like it's pressing down on you. We stood by the bus, my suitcase at my feet, and I waited for him to say something, anything to bridge the gap between us. He hugged me, his arms stiff, and said, "Good luck, Clara. You'll do great." It was the kind of thing you say to a stranger, not a wife. I nodded, my throat tight, and climbed onto the bus. As it pulled away, I watched him through the window, standing there with his hands in his pockets, getting smaller until he disappeared. I cried the whole way to Michigan, not just for Tom, but for the life I was leaving, for the Clara who'd tried so hard to make everyone else happy. Ann Arbor was a shock to the system. The campus was sprawling, alive with students who seemed to know exactly where they were going. I felt like an imposter, lugging my suitcase into a cramped grad student apartment, surrounded by people who talked about research grants and conference papers like it was second nature. My scholarship covered tuition and a small stipend, but it wasn't enough to live on, so I took a part-time job at a campus cafe, steaming milk and wiping counters between classes. The work was familiar, a tether to my old life, but it also reminded me how far I'd come, and how far I still had to go. My program was intense, a whirlwind of lectures, lab work, and late-night study sessions. I was studying wetland ecology, a field I'd fallen in love with during my undergrad research. There was something about wetlands, their quiet resilience, their ability to thrive in places others dismissed as wastelands, that felt like a metaphor for my own life. But the coursework was brutal, and I was constantly second-guessing myself. My classmates were brilliant, some with undergrad degrees from Ivy League schools, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't belong, that I'd gotten in by some fluke. Evelyn's voice was my anchor. We emailed regularly, her messages full of encouragement and practical advice. "You're not there to compete with them," she wrote once. "You're there to become the best version of yourself." I printed that email and taped it to my desk, reading it on nights when I felt like giving up. But the doubt was relentless, a shadow that followed me to class, to the lab, to the cafe where I smiled through exhaustion. I hadn't heard from Tom since I'd left, not even a text, and the silence was a wound that wouldn't close. I wondered if he hated me, if I'd broken us by choosing myself, if I'd made a terrible mistake. Then there was my family. I hadn't spoken to my parents or Ethan since the fight, but their absence was a presence, a ghost that haunted every decision. I'd see families on campus, parents visiting for move-in day, siblings laughing over coffee, and feel this pang, sharp and familiar. I missed them, even after everything. I missed my mother's quiet strength, my father's rare moments of warmth, even Ethan's careless charm. But I couldn't go back, not yet. I wasn't ready to face them, to see if they'd changed, or if I'd just been hoping for something that was never there. One night, about 3 months into the program, I hit a breaking point. I'd gotten a C on a paper, my first ever, and the professor's feedback was a gut punch. Lacks original insight. I sat in my tiny apartment, the walls closing in, and sobbed. I felt like a fraud, like I'd thrown away my marriage, my home, everything, for a dream I wasn't good enough to achieve. I called Evelyn, my voice shaking, and told her I was thinking of dropping out. "I can't do this," I said. "I'm not cut out for it. I should just go back to Ohio." Evelyn didn't sugarcoat it. "Clara, you're in the deep end now, and it's scary as hell, but you didn't come this far to drown. That C? It's not a verdict on your worth. It's a sign you're stretching, growing. You're allowed to fail. What you're not allowed to do is give up." She told me to take a day, to rest, to remember why I'd started. "You're not just doing this for you," she said. "You're doing it for every woman who's been told she's not enough. You're proving them wrong, one step at a time." Her words stayed with me, like a flame I could cup against the wind. I didn't quit. Instead, I started small. I went to office hours, asked questions, stayed late in the lab. I joined a study group, forcing myself to speak up, even when my voice shook. Slowly, I started to find my footing. My next paper got a B, then an A. I presented at a small departmental seminar, my hands trembling but my voice steady, and the professor called my work promising. It was a tiny word, but it felt like a lifeline. I also started to make friends, tentative at first. There was Maya, a fellow grad student with a sharp wit and a laugh that filled a room. She'd grown up in foster care, fought her way through college, and had a fierceness I admired. We'd study together, splitting cheap pizza and trading stories about our lives. She was the first person I told about the miscarriage, about my family, about Tom. She didn't offer platitudes, she just listened, then said, "You're a badass, Clara. You're still standing, that's not nothing." Her belief in me was a mirror, reflecting a version of myself I was starting to recognize. By the end of my first year, I was different. Not fixed, not whole, but stronger, like a bone that had broken and healed tougher. I was still working at the cafe, still scraping by, but I was proud of my grades, my research, the life I was building. I'd started a small project on wetland restoration, inspired by Evelyn's work, and it was gaining traction with my professors. For the first time, I felt like I was doing something that mattered, not just to me, but to the world. But the past wasn't done with me. One afternoon, I got a voicemail from my mother. Her voice was soft, almost fragile. "Clara, it's Mom. I know you're busy, but I'd like to talk. We miss you." I listened to it 3 times, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to call back, to hear her voice, to believe things could be different. But another part, the part that remembered the hospital, the $100,000, the years of being invisible, held me back. I didn't delete the message, but I didn't reply either. I wasn't ready to let them back in, not when I was still finding myself. That night, I sat at my desk, the acceptance letter still taped to the wall, now joined by notes from Maya, feedback from professors, a photo of me presenting at the seminar. I looked at them, these small proofs of my worth, and felt a spark of something new, not just hope, but determination. I wasn't going back to Ohio, to Tom, to the Clara who'd settled for scraps. I was going to keep going, not because I had to prove anything to my family, but because I owed it to myself. The road ahead was long, and I was still scared, still grieving, but I was moving forward. And for the first time, that was enough. My second year in Michigan was when I started to feel the ground beneath me solidify, like I was no longer just treading water, but building something real. The fear that had shadowed me, fear of failing, of being an imposter, didn't vanish, but it grew quieter, drowned out by the rhythm of my new life. Classes, research, the cafe. My days were a blur of purpose, each step pulling me further from the Clara who'd felt so small in that Ohio hospital room. I wasn't healed, not completely, but I was growing, and that growth felt like a rebellion against everyone who'd ever underestimated me. My wetland restoration project became my obsession. It started small, a proposal for a local conservation group, but it caught the attention of my advisor, Dr. Lynn, a no-nonsense woman who'd studied ecosystems from the Arctic to the Everglades. She saw something in my work, or maybe in me, and pushed me to think bigger. "This isn't just about plants and water," she told me one day in her office, her glasses perched on her nose. "It's about resilience, about systems that survive against the odds. Sound familiar?" I blushed, but her words stuck. I began to see the project as a mirror of my own journey, a way to prove that even broken things could thrive. I spent hours in the field, my boots sinking into mud, collecting samples, measuring water levels, mapping plant growth. There was something grounding about the work, the way it demanded my full attention, leaving no room for doubt or grief. I'd come home smelling of earth, my notebook filled with data, and feel a quiet pride that was new to me. My project was gaining traction. Dr. Lynn submitted it to a regional conference, and to my shock, it was accepted. I was going to present my findings to a room full of scientists, people whose names I'd read in textbooks. The thought made my stomach churn, but it also lit a fire in me. This was my chance to be heard, not just by my family, but by the world. Maya was my biggest cheerleader. We'd moved from study buddies to something closer, the kind of friendship where you don't have to explain yourself. She'd drag me to karaoke nights when I was stressed, belt out terrible pop songs, and make me laugh until my sides hurt. One night, after I'd spent hours agonizing over my conference presentation, she plopped onto my couch with a bottle of cheap wine and said, "Clara, you're gonna kill this. You're not just smart, you're unstoppable. Own it." I rolled my eyes, but her belief in me was like oxygen, filling the spaces where doubt had taken root. The conference was in Chicago, a 5-hour bus ride from Ann Arbor. I practiced my presentation until I could recite it in my sleep, but as the date approached, the nerves hit hard. I kept imagining tripping over my words, or worse, standing in front of all those scientists and realizing I had nothing worth saying. The night before I left, I called Evelyn. She was back in Ohio, still running her lab, still my lifeline. "You're not just presenting data," she told me. "You're telling a story, your story, through this work. No one can tell it like you can." Her voice steadied me, and I went to bed, clutching that thought like a talisman. Chicago was overwhelming, towering buildings, crowded streets, a hotel conference room packed with people who seemed to know each other already. I felt small, my blazer too stiff, my name tag crooked. But when I stepped onto the stage, something shifted. The lights were bright, the room quiet, and as I started speaking, I felt the words take on a life of their own. I talked about wetlands, about their quiet strength, their ability to filter toxins, to nurture life in places others ignored. I showed my data, my maps, my photos of muddy fields, blooming with possibility. And I ended with a line I hadn't planned. "These ecosystems teach us that value isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes the most powerful things are the ones we overlook." The applause was polite but warm, and afterward, people came up to me, professors, grad students, even a woman from a conservation nonprofit, who handed me her card and said, "We need people like you." I floated through the rest of the day, high on the feeling of being seen, not as Clara the disappointment, but as Clara the scientist, Clara the voice that mattered. That night, alone in my hotel room, I cried. Not from sadness, but from a release I hadn't known I needed. For the first time, I felt like I was enough. When I got back to Ann Arbor, Dr. Lynn called me into her office. She'd heard about my presentation, and her usually stern face softened. "You're doing something special, Clara," she said. "I'm nominating you for the department's research award. It comes with a grant, small, but enough to expand your project." I stared at her, my mouth open, unable to process it. A grant, an award, me. It wasn't just the money, it was the recognition, the proof that my work, my voice, had weight. The award ceremony was a month later, a small event in the university's auditorium. I wore a dress Maya helped me pick out, navy blue and simple, and stood in the back, my hands sweaty, as the dean read my name. When I walked across the stage to accept the certificate, the applause felt like a wave, lifting me up. Maya was in the audience, whistling like a lunatic, and I laughed through tears. Afterward, at a reception with cheap wine and cheese cubes, Dr. Lin introduced me to a professor from another university who was starting a collaborative project on coastal wetlands. "Clara's someone to watch," she said, and I felt my chest swell, not with pride, but with possibility. But even in that moment, the past lingered. I hadn't told my family about the conference, the award, any of it. Part of me wanted to call them, to rub it in their faces, to say, "Look what I did without you." But another part, the part that still ached for their approval, wanted them to be proud, to see me the way Maya and Evelyn did. I pushed the thought away, focusing on the people around me, the ones who'd chosen to believe in me. But late at night, when the apartment was quiet, I'd wonder what my father would say if he knew, whether my mother would smile, whether Ethan would care. Tom was another ghost. I hadn't heard from him in over a year, and I'd stopped checking his social media, stopped hoping for a text. But sometimes I'd catch myself thinking about him, his quiet laugh, the way he'd make me coffee, on mornings when I was too tired to move. I didn't miss him, not exactly, but I missed the idea of us, the life we might have had if things had been different. I'd filed for divorce 6 months earlier, a decision that felt both inevitable and devastating. He didn't contest it, didn't even call. The papers came in the mail and I signed them alone, my hands steady but my heart heavy. As my second year drew to a close, I was offered a summer internship with the conservation nonprofit from the conference. It was unpaid, but it was a foot in the door, a chance to work on real-world projects, to make a name for myself. I took it without hesitation, even though it meant living on savings and ramen. The internship was in Traverse City, a small town on Lake Michigan, and I spent my days mapping wetlands, meeting with local groups, writing reports that might actually change policy. It was grueling, but it was mine, and every email from my supervisor, praising my work, felt like a brick in the foundation I was building. By the time I returned to Ann Arbor for my final year, I was different, not just stronger, but surer. I walked into classes with my head up, spoke in meetings without second-guessing myself, laughed more easily with Maya. My project was expanding, funded by the grant, and I was starting to dream bigger, maybe a PhD, maybe a career in policy, maybe a life where I didn't just survive, but thrived. I wasn't there yet, but I could see it, like a horizon coming into focus. And for the first time, I believed I could reach it. My final year in Michigan was like running a marathon with the finish line in sight. Exhausting, exhilarating, and terrifying all at once. I was no longer the timid grad student who'd arrived 2 years earlier, clutching a scholarship and a suitcase full of doubts. I'd built something, a reputation, a purpose, a version of myself I could look at without flinching. But the closer I got to graduation, the more I felt the weight of what came next. This wasn't just about a degree anymore. It was about who I'd be when I stepped off that stage, diploma in hand, with no one to tell me what to do. My wetland project had grown into something I barely recognized. What started as a small proposal was now a full-fledged study, funded by my grant, and a new partnership with the conservation nonprofit I'd interned with. I was working with local communities to restore a degraded wetland near Lake Michigan, a project that blended science with real-world impact. I'd spend days in the field, my boots caked in mud, teaching volunteers how to plant native species, and nights at my desk, analyzing data and writing reports. The work was grueling, but it was also alive, pulsing with meaning. Every time a community member thanked me or a patch of marsh grass took root, I felt like I was planting something in myself too, a seed of confidence, of belonging. Dr. Lin was relentless in her support, pushing me to submit my work to journals, to apply for fellowships, to think beyond graduation. "You're not just a student anymore, Clara," she said one afternoon, her voice sharp but kind. "You're a scientist, Start acting like it." Her words were a challenge, and I took it seriously. I sent my research to a prestigious environmental journal, my hands shaking as I hit submit. When the acceptance email came 3 months later, I sat at my desk and cried, not just for the publication, but for the girl who'd once believed she wasn't good enough. The journal wanted me to present my findings at their annual symposium in Washington, D.C., a keynote slot, something unheard of for a grad student. I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. Maya threw me a makeshift celebration in our favorite dive bar, complete with dollar tacos and a playlist of 90s hits. She raised her beer and toasted to Clara, who's out here saving the planet and proving everyone wrong. The bar was loud, the air thick with grease and laughter, and for a moment I let myself feel it, the joy, the pride, the weight of how far I'd come. But even in that moment, there was a quiet ache. I wished Evelyn could have been there, or even my family, to see me not as the daughter who'd disappointed them, but as the woman I'd become. I pushed the thought away, focusing on Maya's grin, the clink of glasses, the life I'd built without them. The DC symposium was a whirlwind. I flew out on a budget airline, my one nice blazer folded carefully in my carry-on. The venue was sleek, filled with scientists, policymakers, and activists whose names I'd seen in articles and TED Talks. I felt like an imposter again, my heart pounding as I waited backstage. But when I stepped into the spotlight, something clicked. I spoke about my project, about wetlands, about resilience, about the power of overlooked systems, and I felt the room lean in. I shared a story I hadn't planned, about growing up in a family that didn't see me, about finding my voice through this work. It was raw, maybe too personal, but when I finished, the applause was thunderous. A woman in the front row, a senior scientist, was wiping her eyes. Later, she found me and said, "Your story isn't just science, it's human. Don't ever stop telling it." That keynote changed everything. My inbox filled with emails, invitations to collaborate, requests for interviews, even a tentative offer from a think tank in Seattle focused on environmental policy. I was dazed, walking through the conference halls with a smile I couldn't suppress. For the first time, I saw a future where I wasn't just surviving, but shaping something bigger. I called Evelyn that night, my voice bubbling with excitement, and she laughed, her pride crackling through the phone. "I knew you had it in you," she said. "This is just the beginning." Back in Ann Arbor, I threw myself into finishing my thesis. The deadline was looming, and I was juggling revisions, job applications, and my wetland project. I'd stopped working at the cafe, living off my stipend and the small honorarium from the symposium, but money was tight. Maya and I shared groceries, splitting bags of rice and cans of beans, and we'd joke about being starving scholars. But the truth was, I didn't feel starved, not anymore. I was hungry, yes, but for the life I was reaching toward, not for the approval I'd once craved. Graduation was 3 months away, and the reality of it was starting to sink in. I'd be Dr. Clara Evans, not Mrs. Tom, not Ethan's sister, not my father's disappointment, but me with a title I'd earned. I started to dream about what came next. Maybe a postdoc, maybe a job with the think tank, maybe even starting my own nonprofit. The possibilities felt endless, but they also scared me. I'd spent so long fighting to get here, I hadn't thought about what it meant to arrive. One evening, as I was revising my thesis, I got an email from my mother. It was short, almost formal. "Clara, I saw your name in an article about the DC symposium. I'm so proud of you. Can we talk?" My heart stopped. I hadn't spoken to her in 2 years, hadn't told her about the keynote, the journal, any of it. I searched online and found the article, a small piece in a science magazine, mentioning my presentation and quoting me on resilience. I stared at the screen, my mother's words echoing in my head. Proud. It was the word I'd wanted my whole life, but now it felt like a stranger's voice. I didn't reply, not right away. Part of me wanted to call her, to pour out everything, the pain, the triumphs, the person I'd become. But another part, the part that remembered the hospital, The silence, the $100,000 for Ethan, wasn't ready. I wasn't sure I'd ever be. Instead, I called Maya, who listened as I rambled, then said, "You don't owe them anything, Clara. Not a call, not forgiveness, nothing. You decide what they get to have of you." Her words were a balm, reminding me that my worth wasn't tied to their pride. As graduation approached, I was invited to speak at a university-wide event for graduating students, a chance to share my story with peers, faculty, and families. I hesitated, worried it would feel too vulnerable, but Dr. Lin pushed me. "Your voice matters," she said, "not just in science, but in showing what's possible." I agreed and spent weeks crafting a speech that wove together my research and my journey. Losing a baby, losing a marriage, losing a family's approval, but finding myself in the process. It was the scariest thing I'd ever written, but also the truest. The night of the speech, I stood in a crowded auditorium, my hands steady despite the butterflies in my stomach. I looked out at the sea of faces, students like me, professors who'd challenged me, Maya grinning from the front row, and I spoke. I talked about wetlands, about resilience, about the power of believing in yourself when no one else does. I shared my pain, not to dwell on it, but to show what it had built. When I finished, the room erupted, and I felt something shift inside me. A certainty that this was who I was meant to be. That speech, that moment, was the peak of everything I'd fought for. But the past was still out there, waiting, and I knew deep down that I couldn't outrun it forever. My final year in Michigan was like running a marathon with the finish line in sight. Exhausting, exhilarating, and terrifying all at once. I was no longer the timid grad student who'd arrived 2 years earlier, clutching a scholarship and a suitcase full of doubts. I'd built something, a reputation, a purpose, a version of myself I could look at without flinching. But the closer I got to graduation, the more I felt the weight of what came next. This wasn't just about a degree anymore. It was about who I'd be when I stepped off that stage, diploma in hand, with no one to tell me what to do. My wetland project had grown into something I barely recognized. What started as a small proposal was now a full-fledged study, funded by my grant, and a new partnership with the conservation nonprofit I'd interned with. I was working with local communities to restore a degraded wetland near Lake Michigan, a project that blended science with real-world impact. I'd spend days in the field, my boots caked in mud, teaching volunteers how to plant native species, and nights at my desk, analyzing data and writing reports. The work was grueling, but it was also alive, pulsing with meaning. Every time a community member thanked me or a patch of marsh grass took root, I felt like I was planting something in myself, too. A seed of confidence, of belonging. Dr. Lin was relentless in her support, pushing me to submit my work to journals, to apply for fellowships, to think beyond graduation. "You're not just a student anymore, Clara," she said one afternoon, her voice sharp but kind. "You're a scientist. Start acting like it." Her words were a challenge, and I took it seriously. I sent my research to a prestigious environmental journal, my hands shaking as I hit submit. When the acceptance email came 3 months later, I sat at my desk and cried, not just for the publication, but for the girl who'd once believed she wasn't good enough. The journal wanted me to present my findings at their annual symposium in Washington, D.C., a keynote slot, something unheard of for a grad student. I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. Maya threw me a makeshift celebration in our favorite dive bar, complete with dollar tacos and a playlist of 90s hits. She raised her beer and toasted, "To Clara, who's out here saving the planet and proving everyone wrong." The bar was loud, the air thick with grease and laughter, and for a moment, I let myself feel it. The joy, the pride, the weight of how far I'd come. But even in that moment, there was a quiet ache. I wished Evelyn could have been there, or even my family, to see me not as the daughter who'd disappointed them, but as the woman I'd become. I pushed the thought away, focusing on Maya's grin, the clink of glasses, the life I'd built without them. The DC symposium was a whirlwind. I flew out on a budget airline, my one nice blazer folded carefully in my carry-on. The venue was sleek, filled with scientists, policymakers, and activists whose names I'd seen in articles and TED Talks. I felt like an imposter again, my heart pounding as I waited backstage. But when I stepped into the spotlight, something clicked. I spoke about my project, about wetlands, about resilience, about the power of overlooked systems, and I felt the room lean in. I shared a story I hadn't planned, about growing up in a family that didn't see me, about finding my voice through this work. It was raw, maybe too personal, but when I finished, the applause was thunderous. A woman in the front row, a senior scientist, was wiping her eyes. Later, she found me and said, "Your story isn't just science, it's human. Don't ever stop telling it." That keynote changed everything. My inbox filled with emails, invitations to collaborate, requests for interviews, even a tentative offer from a think tank in Seattle, focused on environmental policy. I was dazed, walking through the conference halls with a smile I couldn't suppress. For the first time, I saw a future where I wasn't just surviving, but shaping something bigger. I called Evelyn that night, my voice bubbling with excitement, and she laughed, her pride crackling through the phone. "I knew you had it in you," she said. "This is just the beginning." Back in Ann Arbor, I threw myself into finishing my thesis. The deadline was looming, and I was juggling revisions, job applications, and my wetland project. I'd stopped working at the cafe, living off my stipend and the small honorarium from the symposium, but money was tight. Maya and I shared groceries, splitting bags of rice and cans of beans, and we'd joke about being starving scholars. But the truth was, I didn't feel starved, not anymore. I was hungry, yes, but for the life I was reaching toward, not for the approval I'd once craved. Graduation was 3 months away, and the reality of it was starting to sink in. I'd be Dr. Clara Evans, not Mrs. Tom, not Ethan's sister, not my father's disappointment, but me with a title I'd earned. I started to dream about what came next, maybe a postdoc, maybe a job with the think tank, maybe even starting my own nonprofit. The possibilities felt endless, but they also scared me. I'd spent so long fighting to get here, I hadn't thought about what it meant to arrive. One evening, as I was revising my thesis, I got an email from my mother. It was short, almost formal. "Clara, I saw your name in an article about the DC symposium. I'm so proud of you. Can we talk?" My heart stopped. I hadn't spoken to her in 2 years, hadn't told her about the keynote, the journal, any of it. I searched online and found the article, a small piece in a science magazine mentioning my presentation and quoting me on resilience. I stared at the screen, my mother's words echoing in my head. Proud. It was the word I'd wanted my whole life, but now it felt like a stranger's voice. I didn't reply, not right away. Part of me wanted to call her, to pour out everything, the pain, the triumphs, the person I'd become. But another part, the part that remembered the hospital, the silence, the $100,000 for Ethan, wasn't ready. I wasn't sure I'd ever be. Instead, I called Maya, who listened as I rambled, then said, "You don't owe them anything, Clara. Not a call, not forgiveness, nothing. You decide what they get to have of you." Her words were a balm, reminding me that my worth wasn't tied to their pride. As graduation approached, I was invited to speak at a university-wide event for graduating students, a chance to share my story with peers, faculty, and families. I hesitated, worried it would feel too vulnerable, but Dr. Lin pushed me. "Your voice matters," she said, "not just in science, but in showing what's possible." I agreed and spent weeks crafting a speech that wove together my research and my journey, losing a baby, losing a marriage, losing a family's approval, but finding myself in the process. It was the scariest thing I'd ever written, but also the truest. The night of the speech, I stood in a crowded auditorium, my hands steady despite the butterflies in my stomach. I looked out at the sea of faces, students like me, professors who'd challenged me, Maya grinning from the front row, and I spoke. I talked about wetlands, about resilience, about the power of believing in yourself when no one else does. I shared my pain, not to dwell on it, but to show what it had built. When I finished, the room erupted, and I felt something shift inside me, a certainty that this was who I was meant to be. That speech, that moment, was the peak of everything I'd fought for. But the past was still out there, waiting, and I knew deep down that I couldn't outrun it forever. The New York Climate Conference was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. A whirlwind of bright lights, sharp suits, and voices that carried the weight of the world. I was there to speak on a panel about ecosystem restoration, my name printed in the program, alongside scientists I'd idolized for years. Standing backstage, my palms sweaty, I felt the familiar tug of doubt, but it was quieter now, a whisper I could brush aside. When I stepped onto the stage, the spotlight felt like an embrace, and as I spoke about wetlands, about resilience, about the power of systems that thrive against the odds, I saw heads nodding, hands scribbling notes. I ended with a line I'd been turning over in my mind for weeks. The things we overlook, whether it's a marsh or a person, have the power to change everything if we just stop to see them. The applause was electric, and for a moment I felt untouchable. After the panel, I was swarmed. Reporters, students, a senator's aide who wanted to discuss my policy brief. A woman from a major environmental NGO approached me, her card in hand, and said, "We're launching a national initiative on coastal restoration. We want you to lead it." I stared at her, my heart pounding. Lead, not assist, not advise, but lead. It was a job offer, a leap from my role in Seattle, a chance to shape policy on a scale I'd only dreamed of. I thanked her, promised to follow up, and walked away dazed, the weight of possibility settling over me. That night, the conference hosted a gala, a glittering affair in a Manhattan ballroom. I wore a black dress I'd splurged on, feeling like I was playing a part in someone else's story. As I sipped champagne, a reporter from a science outlet approached, recorder in hand. "Your speech was powerful," she said. "But it's your story. Overcoming loss, family expectations, that's resonating. Would you be open to a feature?" I hesitated, the idea of my life laid bare in print, both thrilling and terrifying. But I said yes because I was done hiding, done shrinking to fit someone else's idea of me. The feature ran a week later, titled "From Grief to Grit: The Scientist Redefining Resilience." It was raw, unflinching, my miscarriage, my family's dismissal, Ethan's $100,000, my journey to this moment. It quoted my keynote, my podcast, even Maya, who'd gushed about my badassery. The article went viral, shared across social media, picked up by bigger outlets. My phone buzzed with notifications, strangers saying I'd inspired them, colleagues praising my courage, a high school friend I hadn't spoken to in years asking to reconnect. I was overwhelmed, not just by the attention, but by the realization that my story wasn't just mine anymore. It was a beacon for others, a proof that pain could build something beautiful. Back in Seattle, the NGO's offer was formalized: a 6-figure salary, a team of 10, a mandate to influence national policy. I negotiated a start date after my current contract, giving me time to transition. My think tank colleagues threw me a send-off lunch, toasting my meteoric rise. Priya, my supervisor, pulled me aside and said, "You're not just leaving a job, Clara, you're leaving a mark." Her words stayed with me, a reminder that I wasn't just moving forward, I was rewriting what was possible. But the past was catching up. The article had reached Ohio. I got an email from my mother, longer this time. "Clara, I read the feature. I had no idea how much you went through. I'm so sorry. Please, let's talk. We're so proud, but we miss you." Then a voicemail from my father, his voice gruff, unfamiliar. "Clara, it's Dad. I saw the article. We didn't know. Call us, please." And finally, another text from Ethan. "Clara, I messed up. I didn't get it back then. Can I see you?" Each message was a stone in my chest, heavy with memory. I didn't reply, but I saved them, unable to delete the threads that still tied me to them. A month later, I was invited to speak at my alma mater in Ann Arbor, a keynote for their annual science symposium. It was a homecoming, a chance to stand where I'd once felt so small and show how far I'd come. Maya met me at the airport, her hug fierce, and we spent the night catching up over pizza, laughing like no time had passed. The symposium was packed, students, faculty, even Evelyn, who'd driven up from Ohio. I stood on the stage, my voice steady, and told my story, not just the science but the heart of it, the loss, the fight, the fire that had carried me here. I dedicated my speech to Evelyn, calling her the first person who saw me, and when I looked at her in the audience, her eyes were shining. Afterward, as I signed programs and shook hands, I saw them. My parents standing at the back of the auditorium, Ethan beside them. My heart stopped. They looked older, my father's hair grayer, my mother's face softer, Ethan's grin hesitant. I hadn't invited them, hadn't told them I'd be here. The article, I realized, they'd seen it, found the event, come unannounced. I froze, the crowd fading as Maya touched my arm. "You okay?" she whispered. I nodded, but I wasn't sure. They approached slowly, as if afraid I'd bolt. My mother spoke first, her voice trembling. "Clara, you were incredible. We're so proud." My father cleared his throat, his eyes on the floor. "We didn't understand, Clara. Not then. I'm sorry." Ethan stepped forward, his hands in his pockets. "I was an idiot," he said. "I didn't see what it did to you. I'm sorry, Clara, for everything." The words I'd waited years to hear hung in the air, but they didn't feel like I'd imagined. They were heavy, not healing, a reminder of the wound they'd left. I looked at them, my mother's pleading eyes, my father's discomfort, Ethan's guilt, and felt a storm inside me. Part of me wanted to scream, to ask why it took a viral article for them to care. Part of me wanted to hug them, to bridge the gap of years, but I didn't do either. I took a breath and said, "Thank you for coming. I need time." My mother's face fell, but she nodded. My father looked like he wanted to say more, but he didn't. Ethan gave me a small, sad smile. They left quietly, and I stood there, shaking, Maya's hand on my shoulder. That night, in my hotel room, I cried, not for them, but for me, for the Clara who'd carried their rejection so long. I didn't know if I'd forgive them, if I'd ever call, if I'd let them back in. But I knew one thing, their apology didn't define me. Their pride didn't make me. I'd built this life, my work, my voice, my worth, without them. And that was power, the kind no one could take away. The auditorium moment spread online, captured by a student who'd filmed it. Posts called it the confrontation of the year, praising my grace, my strength. I didn't read them all, but I saw enough to know the world was watching, rooting for me. Maya sent me a meme of a queen on a throne, captioned, "You handling that like a boss." I laughed, but I felt it, a crown I'd forged myself, heavy but mine. As I prepared to move to DC for the NGO job, I packed my life again, each box a testament to the woman I'd become. I wasn't running from my family anymore, but I wasn't running toward them either. I was running toward me, toward a life where I decided my worth, and that, I knew, was enough. The move to DC was like stepping into a new skin, uncomfortable at first, but unmistakably mine. The city buzzed with purpose, its streets lined with monuments and ambition, a place where every conversation felt like it could shift the world. My new role at the NGO was daunting, leading a national initiative on coastal restoration, managing a team, briefing lawmakers on Capitol Hill. I was 31, younger than most of my colleagues, and the weight of their expectations pressed against me. But I'd carried heavier things before, grief, betrayal, my own doubts, and I knew I could carry this too. Each morning, as I walked past the reflecting pool to my office, I felt a quiet thrill. This was my life, the one I'd built from ashes. Work consumed me. I spent my days in meetings, drafting proposals, and traveling to coastal communities to assess restoration needs. My team was a mix of scientists, policy wonks, and advocates, each brilliant in their own way. And I learned to lead by listening, by trusting the fire that had carried me this far. We were pushing for legislation to protect wetlands nationwide, a bill that could redefine environmental policy for decades. My name was on briefings that reached senators' desks, my research cited in hearings. Every late night, every tense negotiation, every small victory felt like a stitch in the fabric of something bigger. Not just a career, but a legacy. Outside work, DC was a puzzle I was still solving. I lived in a small apartment in Adams Morgan, with creaky floors and a window that overlooked a mural of a woman with flowers in her hair. I'd walk to coffee shops on weekends, my laptop open, writing articles or preparing for speeches. The podcast episode, the viral article, the Ann Arbor confrontation, they'd made me a name, someone invited to panels, quoted in op-eds, asked to inspire. I said yes to most, not for the spotlight, but because I knew what it meant to feel unseen, and I wanted my voice to reach anyone who needed it. Loneliness crept in, though, in the quiet moments. I'd made friends, co-workers who shared wine, after long days, a neighbor who invited me to trivia nights. But I missed the easy closeness of Maya, the steady wisdom of Evelyn. We stayed in touch, video calls and long texts, but it wasn't the same as their presence. I thought about Tom sometimes, not with longing, but with a soft ache for the life we might have had. I wondered if he'd heard about me, if he was proud, if he regretted letting me go. But those thoughts were fleeting, like leaves on a river, carried away by the current of my new reality. My family was the question I couldn't answer. Their messages, my mother's emails, my father's voicemail, Ethan's texts, sat untouched, a folder in my inbox I opened but never replied to. The Ann Arbor moment had been a reckoning, but it hadn't healed me. Their apologies, their pride, felt like too little, too late, a bandage on a wound that had already scarred. I didn't hate them, not anymore, but I didn't trust them either. Forgiveness felt like a door I wasn't ready to open, maybe because I was afraid of what I'd find on the other side. One afternoon, about 6 months into my DC life, I got a call from a community college in Maryland. They were starting a scholarship for women in STEM, inspired by my story, and wanted to name it after me, the Clara Evans Scholarship. I sat at my desk, stunned, as the dean explained. It would fund tuition for women who'd faced adversity, women like me. They asked me to speak at the launch, to share my journey, to meet the first recipients. I said yes, my voice thick, because this was what I'd been working for, not just to rise, but to lift others with me. The scholarship launch was held in a small auditorium, filled with students, faculty, and local reporters. I stood at the podium, a silver pin on my blazer, a Marsh Reed, a gift from my team to mark the wetland bill's progress. I looked out at the audience, at the young women in the front row, their eyes bright with hope, and I told my story. Not the polished version, but the raw one, the miscarriage, the $100,000, the years of feeling invisible. I talked about the people who'd saved me, Evelyn, Maya, Dr. Lynn, and the fire I'd found in myself. Your worth, I said, my voice steady, doesn't depend on someone else's validation. It's in you always, waiting for you to claim it. When I introduced the first scholarship recipients, 3 women, each with their own stories of struggle, I felt a lump in my throat. One, a single mother studying biology, hugged me afterward, whispering, "You made me believe I could do this." I held her tight, tears in my eyes, because she was me, 10 years ago, and I was her future, proof that the impossible was possible. The event made local news, then national, the scholarship fund, growing with donations inspired by the coverage. My name, Clara Evans, was becoming a symbol, not just of science, but of survival. That night, I went home and opened my laptop, the folder of my family's messages staring back at me. I read them again, each word a pinprick. My mother's plea, "We miss you." My father's regret, "We didn't know." Ethan's admission, "I messed up." I thought about the scholarship, about the women it would help, about the life I'd built without their help. And I realized something. I didn't need their validation anymore, but I didn't need to carry their pain either. I could choose what to hold, what to release. I didn't call them. Instead, I wrote a letter, not to send, but for me. I poured out everything, the hurt, the anger, the love I'd buried. I wrote about the hospital, the silence, the $100,000 that had broken me. I wrote about the woman I'd become, the one they hadn't seen until the world did. And I ended with a truth. I might forgive them one day, but I didn't need to. My worth was mine, forged in mud and tears, stronger than their approval or their absence. I folded the letter, tucked it into a drawer, and felt lighter, like I'd set down a weight I'd carried too long. The wetland bill passed a key committee vote a month later, my team's work, my work, praised in the press. I framed the marsh reed pin, hanging it on my wall beside my diploma, a reminder of what I'd grown from. I kept speaking, kept leading, kept building. The scholarship fund grew, more women applying each year, their stories echoing mine. I didn't know what the future held, a bigger role, a new city, maybe even love again. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I was Clara, and that was enough. As I stood on my balcony one evening, the city lights stretching before me, I thought about the girl I'd been, the one who'd sat in that hospital bed, grieving and unseen. I wished I could tell her what I knew now, that pain doesn't define you, but it can shape you, that the world will try to make you small, but you can choose to be vast, that your worth is a flame no one can extinguish. I looked out at the horizon, a marsh reed pin in my pocket, and whispered to her, to me, to every woman listening, "You are enough."